All right, everybody, welcome today. My name is John Wizard. I'm a member of the YIMBY Law team. I'm the housing element coordinator and policy director for the campaign for fair housing elements. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I appreciate it. It's a Sunday, but we've got a wonderful conversation in store, and I'm just so excited to be able to share this space and this time with you. I'll just say very quickly, I apologize for some background noise. We're building an ADU at my place, and I guess today is the day for the roof, and quiet is not a word that comes to framers and roofers. So I apologize in advance, but let's get started with introductions from our esteemed collection of experts. Why don't we hear first from Manny Escamilla, an urban planner for the city of Oakland. If you would just let us know who you are and how you came here today.
Sure. Well, thank you, Manny Escamilla, operating out of the city of Oakland currently. I guess previous experience was, and kind of what I'll be talking about today is really more about the history of Orange County. So for about 15 years, I worked for the city of Santa Ana, down here as an archivist, and then in the urban planning department. So kind of talking a little bit more about the development history of Orange County and how that might relate to the development of suburbs in other parts of California. So hopefully for anyone not from Orange County, this will be educational for you.
Great, thanks for being with us today. Next, let's hear from Nadia Aziz, the directing attorney for the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nadia Aziz, she, her. I'm the directing attorney of the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley that we provide free legal services in 3 areas: children and youth, health, and housing. Our housing work focuses on preventing the displacement of low-income families, and I've had a lot of experience working in the fair housing world. So I'm excited to present about that today.
Wonderful, thanks. Next up is our friend from the city of Berkeley, District 1, Councilmember Rashi Kesarwani.
Thank you so much, John, and it's great to be with you all on this Sunday afternoon. As John said, my name is Rashi Kesarwani. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I was elected in 2018 to serve as a council member in the city of Berkeley. And my district includes the North Berkeley Bay Area Rapid Transit Station. And some of my priorities related to housing include development of the surface parking lots at the North Berkeley and Ashby BART stations, which are 2 of our stations in the city of Berkeley. And our goal is to create a high level of affordability at both stations. I'm also very focused, speaking of ADUs, John, making it easier for homeowners to build accessory dwelling units. And finally, I'm going to be speaking more today about implementing an updated housing element that prioritizes equity and sustainability. And I'll say that I grew up in Orange County in Cypress, and I hold a Master of Public Policy from UC Berkeley, and that's what brought me up to the Bay Area. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Just by way of sort of orienting to our conversation, housing elements are these incredibly parochial, obtuse documents that just live within our general plans. And, I haven't done a formal survey or anything, but 9 out of 10 people have probably never heard of one. And that they control 8 years of policy in a city at a given time. And for bad actor cities, for those that don't get all of their ducks in a row and get signed off by the state, it's still 4 years. But nevertheless, half a decade to a decade of time that we've baked in our vision for what housing looks like in our communities. This is a really important opportunity we have to, like Rashi was saying, build into our policy documents equity and the recognition that people make cities the places we want to go, and people start businesses, and people start nonprofits, and people need places to live. People are why cities are attractive, and if we continue to keep them out, they are no longer really cities, and that's what hurts transit. That's what hurts economic activity, and ultimately leads to declining enrollment in schools. And so the case for housing elements could not be stronger. And one of the prompts that I would like the panelists and the participants together to kind of think about as we move through our conversation is, what's something that you do in your sphere of influence, and the people and the places and the lives that we are all connected to? What's something that you do that is working toward a more inclusive suburbia? How are we going to bake in this notion of equity and fair housing into our cities, our communities, and our neighborhoods. So with that, I just wanted to do a quick housekeeping issue, and that is that we won't be answering any Q&A within the chat. Please do submit questions. And we will, Elizabeth Hansberg, People for Housing OC, Kelsey Baines, Peninsula for Everyone, they're going to massage the Q&A and combine questions so that we can be most effective in getting you those answers. So please feel free to use the Q&A, ask away, but don't put them in the chat, use the Q&A, so that way we don't miss them. And with that, I will say, please, Manny, take it away.
Okay, John, well, thank you so much for that. I'm going to see if the sharing screen will work as it did previously. Okay, so is everyone able to see this? Let's see.
It's loading, but I can see it. I see it now. Okay,
perfect. Okay, so again, thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to start my timer so I don't go too over time. Thank you again for joining us on this Sunday afternoon at this point. So again, Manny Escamilla, going to be kind of talking about that history of segregation and development patterns within Orange County. So I was essentially raised in the city of Santa Ana. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, it's a majority Latinx community. At this point, it's essentially 80 to 85% Latinx, and it has a very interesting history of civil rights that often gets overshadowed by kind of bigger national trends. But I think kind of provides a nice little model as to how particular communities were segregated, and then how individuals within those communities fought back over time. So I'm hoping to give a little bit of an overview there. This photograph that you're seeing in the background is taken from the New York Times, talking about the new face of California. And here, the Logan Barrio, nice kind of historic barrio, one of four kind of centers of the Mexican American community here in Orange County. You kind of see all the individuals that actually participated and fought for the United States in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and Korea, and beyond. So very much a local cultural landmark. My own background and training is as an urban planner and as an archivist. So I've basically spent half my time looking at things in archives, and then the other half trying to figure out what to do with the built environment. And that's currently what I'm doing over in the city of Oakland. From a more practical perspective, I try to advise local policymakers down in Santa Ana. There's a kind of new progressive majority that's really concerned about housing rights. And our concerns here are much more about how do you maintain and not displace with increased development. So we are a densely built out city. The city of Santa Ana is second in density only to the city of San Francisco in the state of California. And our big concern is whether or not individuals that basically helped create this community will be able to remain here. So that's kind of more on the policy side. But getting into the history, there's always kind of been this tension, right? So this is coming out of like a newspaper, the Costa Mesa Globe, no longer around. But basically this tension between Orange County and LA, right? So this tension between the suburbs and the metropolitan center, this being about a census count, but a very, in my opinion, racist caricature of LA County. And this is really the political climate in the 1950s that we're dealing with in Orange County, right? So you have minority communities living within this kind of racist power structure and trying to navigate how they live within that space. So there's a lot of instances in which really it was only the courts that were able to try to equalize some civil rights issues that were ongoing, both with housing segregation, discrimination in schooling, and even, as we'll see, discrimination in where people were buried. So those sorts of things were very actively present in the county of Orange. The thing that I think, sometimes we kind of go to right away is that, okay, these were red line communities. However, in Orange County, we were never actually, there was never a HOLOC map, so there was never a homeowners loan corporation map that kind of showed what areas were good, what areas were bad. It was done through much more informal means. It was done through real estate agents, through racially restricted housing covenants, and just general practices. So that's what made it a little bit more insidious, because it wasn't really just written into law. It was something that was a little bit more hidden in the background, but still operated on a daily basis. And one way we kind of see that, even if we go back to the 1870s and looking at the census records for the county as it kind of breaks away from Los Angeles, or right before it breaks away from Los Angeles, you'll see a series of names. But what always surprised me kind of going through this is there were actually a lot of Spanish surnames already here. So kind of this idea that, there's a new minority kind of coming into Orange County and changing its character, it doesn't necessarily hold true. There are, in fact, a lot of wealthy, or you'd say even pseudo-aristocratic Spanish landowners that were essentially kind of centers of power here in the previous kind of rancho economy that predated the Anglo takeover of California. And you see their decline over time. So that was done through kind of legal maneuvering, dealing with a new tax and property structure that wasn't there under the Spanish, a lot of intermarriages and kind of things that happened and essentially took power away from these minority communities as California grew. So that was, to me, I think, an important part of the context here in the area of Orange County. And you also have incidences of racialized violence. So the 1892 lynching of Francisco Torres in downtown Santa Ana was one of those kind of hallmark events. Really, one of the last lynchings in the West, but still very much present kind of in our day to day. Doesn't get memorialized, but this was in downtown Santa Ana. The 1906 burning of Santa Ana's Chinatown. So we did have a Chinatown in Orange County. This is out of a Sanborn map kind of showing where that was. And it was actually our fire department down here that actually burnt that out. So there's a whole kind of history there. And I'm not going to be doing any of these items justice, but just to kind of give a high level overview, kind of getting into the modern era. The Chinese helped build the railroads and actually a lot of the road structures here in central Orange County. But again, were not welcomed after the labor was not needed. So that racialized violence was present early on. The segregated school, so this is the Logan Elementary School that was built next to the Logan Barrio. And we see here class 1B in the 1920s, I believe, right before there was any kind of pushback against that. This is the Logan School being demolished in 29. But it was part of a thriving community, and it's something where this is part of my own personal work as a local historian, is trying to get these types of narratives built into our local history. So that's still an ongoing project for me. But you have other cases that I think are very important, kind of at this national level, that don't necessarily get talked about. So Das et al. V. Bernal happened in the middle of World War II, in the 1943 case. And this basically was about a Mexican-American veteran trying to purchase a home in the area of Fullerton. So, and they were denied, took it to court, and a local judge ruled in Mr. Bernal's favor, and he was able to actually purchase a home in the Orange County suburbs. But it took a lawsuit in 1943. The story was covered by Time magazine, but then not really remembered until recently. So some good work out of UCLA Chicano Studies Center bringing this story to light. Another case that's gotten a little bit more attention is the Mendez versus Westminster case. Not to say that the federal government ever makes mistakes, but we always like to say, at least in our historical circles, it was Mendez et al. Versus Westminster et al. So there were multiple families, not just the Mendez family. They were one of the families, but there were multiple families involved with suing multiple school districts in Orange County. So that, the next round of the sticker, we're hoping we get double et als in there to be a little bit more historically accurate. But this was prior to Brown v. versus Board of Education. It was a really important case as far as getting some of the precedent in the courts to allow the ending of school segregation in the state of California. Kazu Masuda, so he was actually killed in action overseas in World War II. His body was found and then returned back to the United States. However, he was denied burial in Westminster. So he actually had a case of soldiers coming back after serving and being denied. So there was an uproar locally. He eventually got buried in the current plot that he's at in Westminster. But it was one of those things where it took pressure and kind of community outrage in order to do something about this. Salmon Lee in 1954 denied housing in Garden Grove. Again, this was even after fair housing laws were enacted, but there was this informal mechanism by which the realtor essentially said that I would be fired for selling to you. So even though the laws might have changed, the general practice was still to deny housing access to a two-time Olympic gold medal winner, right? So this is something where these cases kind of kept coming forward, and it took individuals that had a strong enough will to basically fight against the segregation that they were facing. Another person that I'm truly inspired by, Reitman, Miss Melky here. She's still alive, and this is actually down the street from where I grew up, over on Highland in central Santa Ana. She was denied housing, and basically because her and husband were African Americans living in the African American part of town, and they wanted to move outside of it, and they were denied and told that there was no vacancy, right? So it wasn't that, again, they were being told that they could not, purchase it. They were just given other excuses, and this made it up to the Supreme Court. It helped overturn Prop 14 here in California. So again, these are things that were going on in the Orange County suburbs. So the suburbs themselves being a point where these types of fights occur. I don't have too much time, I think, at this point. I'm getting up to the 10-minute mark almost, but I'd just like to say that all this is to kind of provide the context into which planners then operate. So by 1977, the city of Santa Ana is creating a community plan. We make beautiful maps as urban planners. We start trying to identify particular issues. So we can maybe go over this more if people are curious about this. But this is a plan for the downtown, kind of identifying some issues that were noted by urban planners, doing the best that they could do in their particular time and place. But some of the suggestions were basically, don't invest in this neighborhood. It's too far gone. The city should not be investing in it. In fact, it should be left to rot, or it should be converted over to industrial, and then people will naturally move out over time. Like, those are professional suggestions coming in from professional planners for a city long-range plan, and those were things that were still happening in the 1970s. Certain neighborhoods fought back and organized. Again, this is the Logan neighborhood fighting back with a certain individual, Sam Romero, there. And after all that, basically, this is kind of what remains in the central part. This little neighborhood surrounded by industrial facilities, but still somewhat there. Unfortunately, other neighborhoods to the south were completely wiped out. So everywhere you pretty much see like a large industrial building. It used to be parts of the Mexican American community south of the railroad track. And even to our modern era, on the right-hand side, you see these kind of blank spaces that were taken over by the city in the 1990s and 2000s as part of road widening. So it's actually, in our particular community, it wasn't so much freeways as much as road widenings and industrial encroachment that destroyed a lot of these historic Mexican American neighborhoods. So that's pretty much what I have. And this is something that I'm working on currently, trying to figure out how all this kind of relates to our tax base. But with that, I think I've already gone over about a minute. So yield the rest of my time, and hopefully some of you all found that educational, if not too detailed.
Well, Manny, that was excellent, and I think it really goes to the point. I saw a comment in the chat. It goes to the point that while explicit racism with deed restrictions and covenants that prevented Black and Asian and Latino families from becoming homeowners through the Fair Housing Act, but then the sort of the hushed and winking, I can't sell to you because I'll lose my job, even though it's a crime if I deny you this opportunity. We now see that the expression is indirect racism, and that even includes this sort of conversation around model minorities. You have this 2-time gold medal winner. You have people who have achieved great things that are denied basic opportunities and access to things everybody else can have. And it's because they just wouldn't fit in here. And then so people who don't hit that threshold of model minority are nowhere. They're lost because these rules are meant to keep people out, and they have to invent new things to keep the model minority class members out. So with that, I'll pass it to our lawyer in the audience. Nadia, please share with us.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, I'm the lawyer, so this will be the boring legal part of the conversation. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this.
Nadia, it seems like your mic might have cut out. I wasn't hearing that last bit, but it looked like you were talking.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, let me just try to get this on full screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Fair Housing Act and kind of the legal obligations to affirmatively further fair housing. The Fair Housing Act was passed, was signed literally a week after MLK was assassinated, and so it's really steeped in history. And the purpose, really, when it was passed, was to address segregation. And we know, we're still almost 60 years later, or 50 years later, still, we're still not there, and we still haven't done enough. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Federal Fair Housing Act, it prohibits discrimination in the rental, sale, or financing of housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. So these are things like you can't, like you can't not rent to someone because they're Black or because they're gay. So that's kind of the Fair Housing Act, like that most people think about when they think about the Federal Fair Housing Act. But it also includes a provision that requires HUD to administer programs and activities related to housing and urban development in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. For many years, it wasn't until like the 2000s that people really got into what that means. And it's really thinking about the affirmative, like when we're talking about just stopping discrimination, that's one step, but the AFFH is really talking about affirmatively doing things to try to make housing more accessible to people of all races and all backgrounds. So a little bit about how affirmatively furthering fair housing has been used in the legal context. There's several cases that I just want to point out to you. There's this case out of Chicago where tenants were successful in using the claim that the city failed to affirmatively further fair housing when there was a lack of adequate relocation assistance, meaning that the people who were being displaced from this subsidized housing project were not able to stay, and it required them to stay in more segregated neighborhoods. Also, the demolishment of subsidized apartments in Chicago. That there's another case that mentions that the city has an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, and so if you're demolishing a subsidized apartment building without an adequate place for people to go, you're basically furthering segregation, and you're not taking affirmative steps to stop that. Again, it's been used in the demolition of public housing context. California has codified affirmatively furthering fair housing, and I'll talk a little bit in my presentation about how that came about. But I think the government code here really has a good definition of what that means and what the obligations that cities have, what that means. And it says that affirmatively furthering fair housing means taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcomes patterns of discriminations, fosters inclusive communities, frees from barriers that restrict access to opportunity. So it's really about taking affirmative action, a city taking affirmative steps. I want to give you an example from a case that I litigated and I brought, and that was Buana Vista Mobile Home Park in Palo Alto. So for those of you who are not familiar with Palo Alto, it's a very high income city in Palo Alto, in Silicon Valley, probably the NIMBYest of NIMBY cities, and it's primarily white and Asian. And so there's a mobile home park right on El Camino that was in the process of being closed. And this mobile home park was mostly Latino, I think over 90%, over 80% were Spanish speakers, and they were very low income. And so, we ended up having to sue the city to try to preserve the mobile home park. And we made the argument that the city's failure or the city's acceptance of closing the park without adequate relocation assistance for the residents to be able to stay in Palo Alto contradicted their obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. If this park closed, the city would have lost 10% of its Latinx population. And so that's an example of how we used it in a case that I worked on. And I just want to share some of the maps that we use as part of our case. So the darker blue areas are a concentration of Latinx people in populations. The darker the blue, the more Latinx people in that particular community. And the yellow triangles are actual mobile home parks. So in Watson, this is a picture from Watsonville, which shows that there's higher concentration of Latinx people around mobile home parks. This is Morgan Hill, similarly more blue, closer to the mobile home parks. This is San Jose, also, there's higher concentrations of Latinx people next to mobile home parks. And then this is Palo Alto and Buana Vista, which just shows that, if this mobile home park was forced to close without adequate relocation for people to be able to stay, it would have, exacerbated the segregation that already exists in a place like Palo Alto. Okay, so getting to what we're supposed to be talking about today, which is the assessment of fair housing, which is now part of the housing element process. So for many, many years, entitlement jurisdictions, that means cities and counties and that had money, have to do an analysis, or had to do an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. So they basically had to create a document that said, these are all the impediments that exist in our community that prevent people from accessing higher opportunity areas, that exacerbate segregation, and this is what we're going to do about it. In many cases, in many cities, it was not great. It was just kind of like a checkbox. And some cities didn't even do it. There's a famous case out of Westchester about the fact that they never did an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. With the Obama administration, they changed it from an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice to an assessment of fair housing. And so they created a very robust tool where HUD actually created maps that showed patterns of segregation and racially and ethnic, where there was racial and ethnic concentrations of poverty in a community, and asked the city to take that information, take that data and do an analysis of it. Before the AFHs actually started getting completed, unfortunately, the Trump administration came into office and they just suspended the rule. And so Biden's trying to look at reinstating it, but California kind of reacted to that by creating their own obligation for cities to create an assessment of fair housing. So this is part of the government code. Well, first, what the city did was what California did was that they codified the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing in the government code, and that's in the government code, and it basically requires the same requirement as the Fair Housing Act, that cities and jurisdictions administer its programs and activities in a way that's going to affirmatively further fair housing. And California also adopted the AFH standard and included it as part of the housing element process. And so that's what we're talking about today. And so each locality, each jurisdiction, each housing authority has to complete an assessment of fair housing. And so they have to look at publicly available data, things like segregation maps, redlining maps, where racial and ethnic concentrations of poverty are, who lives in public housing, who lives in subsidized housing, where people are. Take that data and identify are contributing to discrimination, like are your zoning laws, do you only allow single family zoning, and is that leading to, people of color having less opportunity to a particular area? So cities have to look at this data, identify what's happening, identify why certain things are, why certain people can live here and certain people can't. And then they have to set goals to overcome those factors. So for example, maybe it's that you change your zoning laws to allow for single family, to allow for zoning that's not single family, or create some kind of Ellis Act to protect rent control properties. So those are some of the types of things that cities can do and advocates can start advocating for as part of the AFH process. California also requires an AFH to be submitted and approved by HCD as part of the housing element process. Cities are also required to have a robust community engagement process, and I think this is a great way for people who are interested in equity and fair housing to get involved and to advocate for policies that are going to lead to more inclusive communities and inclusive suburbs. So I think I'm almost at the 10-minute mark, so I'll pass it along to Rashi.
Thanks very much, Nadia. And I just wanted to point out for the audience that we heard about the intro of Nadia's presentation was about federal fair housing, and then the end was about California state affirmatively furthering fair housing. And while that nomenclature is used both at the federal and the state level, what we do in California is like she said, part of the housing element process, and every public agency is required to affirmatively further fair housing in the activities they undertake, and that is separate and apart from what the federal definition is and the duties through HUD and other federally financed activities. They're not one or the other, but they are different processes that cities go through, and the analysis that we're undertaking in the housing element process is particular to California. The other thing that I would say is that, these are very compact conversations or very compact presentations rather that we're having. And so one of the points that I really want to ferret out for everybody is that when we talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, the opposite of affirmatively furthering fair housing is not just simply not doing it. The opposite is, like Nadia said, affirmatively furthering segregation. And the other side of that coin is racially concentrated areas of affluence, or the concentration of wealth and the invisible but still very real walls that keep people of lower income out of high opportunity areas. And so I would love to hear more from Rashi about things happening in Berkeley and how they're having that conversation.
Thank you very much, John, and great to get the education from Manny and Nadia. Thank you so much. So I want to
just really
start.
quick, Rashi, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. Nadia, can you turn your screen sharing off, please? Just so that everybody can see Rashi in living color, full screen.
Okay.
It's going to be just a second longer. And I don't know.
Sorry, I'm like tech. Oh, there you go.
All done. Thank you. Go ahead, Rashi.
Okay, great. And everyone, I don't have slides, so you just have to listen. So I was asked today, and also, John, I don't have my timer on, so if I just start losing track of time, feel free to interrupt me. So, I was asked to talk about what happened in the city of Berkeley for us to take action as a city council to move away from single family zoning. So many of you may not be aware that earlier this year in February and March, our city council did two things. One, we unanimously passed a resolution declaring our intent to end single family zoning by the end of 2022. And then we followed up with a more operational council item, which was a referral to our planning commission to undertake an 18-month-long community input process to update our housing element. And essentially we proposed doing that through two strategies. One was locating increased density along our transit corridors so that we can grow in a sustainable way. And the other component of that was looking at adding density into our traditionally single family home neighborhoods so that we can grow in an equitable way. And I know many of you are housing policy nerds here, so you know about the regional housing needs allocation process that John described, where every 8 years cities are required to update their housing elements. And this year, because of a change in state law, cities are required to significantly increase the number of homes that they zone for. So in the city of Berkeley, we previously 8 years ago only had to zone for about 3,000 homes. And this time we are being asked to accommodate 9,000. And we're roughly a city of 120,000. So this is going to be a very, exciting and important undertaking for us. And I want to actually start my remarks by talking about, there was this article in the Chronicle today that, for those of you who are in the Bay Area, you may have seen. It was about the number of evictions that are taking place in San Francisco, and that those are, continuing to increase in a particular neighborhood. And they profiled an older lesbian couple. They held working class jobs their whole lives, and they're now being evicted at the age of, being in their late 60s and early 70s from the Castro neighborhood of San Francisco. And for those of you who know, the Castro is one of the first LGBTQ neighborhoods in the US. And I think I just wanted to highlight that story because I think it speaks to, the important role that tenant protections play in our housing conversation, but that ultimately, if we are not creating more homes, we run into these situations where people who get displaced don't have another place to go to, and new people who we might want to include in our community, especially a place like the Castro, which has been this refuge for LGBTQ folks. They don't have a place. And right now in Berkeley, the median price of a home is 1.5 million. Across the Bay Area, it's 1 million. And I was just looking this up today. Across the state, it's now more than 800,000. So I think for me as an elected official, it is really important to look at how we can create more homes. That has to be part of the solution to this shortage. So getting back to what we did in Berkeley, how did we get to that point in February and March where we actually took this action to move towards ending single family zoning? I want to talk about kind of the stories that I told to my constituents about why we were doing this, because some of you may have seen, for those of you who follow the discourse, Matt Iglesias in his subscription newsletter, he recently wrote about, the case for making a racial justice argument for zoning reform versus an economic growth argument. And there was some polling done between Vox and Data for Progress that showed that actually the economic growth argument is slightly more persuasive than the racial justice argument. And basically what that looks like is, trying to tell people that if we create more homes, we will have more high opportunity. We'll basically be able to create opportunities for people to access these high opportunity regions with good jobs, and that will allow more people to benefit. And I don't really have the answer to this debate. I think for people who are working on these issues in your communities, you really have to know your community and know what argument will work and know what argument you're comfortable making. I sort of made perhaps a hybrid of these two arguments. I did talk about the racial justice component, but I also talked about, wanting people to have an opportunity to live in a high opportunity neighborhood. And, to the extent that we create more homes, they're not going to exclusively be for people of color. They would just be for folks who are able to live in those homes. So that actually benefits anybody who is locked out of our community right now. So let me tell you a little bit more about the history in Berkeley and what I talked about with my constituents. And I think this, Manny sort of did this for Santa Ana, for Orange County. In Berkeley, we actually invented the concept of single family zoning that is now ubiquitous across the country. It was invented here in Berkeley in 1916 by a prominent real estate developer. And at the time, the intent was really to separate white families from people of color by design and also by law. And this single family home zoning development, it included racial covenants, barring homeowners from selling or renting their homes to people of color. And one of my colleagues, Vice Mayor Lori Drosty, she represents that neighborhood. And if you go there today, you will see the old gates that marked that neighborhood. That it was demarcated with gates, and you see some of these remnants across the city. And it's important for us to, as a community, to remind ourselves of that history. So we talked about that. I talked about the Fair Housing Act of 1968 and fair housing law, which Nadia went over. And I really tried to break down, why exactly this has a racial lens to it. And, what I talked about is that because of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, you know, families of color can still be victims of housing and mortgage lending discrimination. But I don't want to minimize that by any means, but we often also see that the primary barrier many families generally face nowadays to owning a home in the high cost Bay Area in Berkeley is insufficient household income. And I tried to really explain, you know, the pronounced differences in median household income that persist by race that have existed for centuries, as a result of, you know, beginning with slavery and then Jim Crow. On the whole, this means that Black and Latino families are statistically more likely to be lower income, and therefore they are going to be shut out of neighborhoods that are zoned for expensive single family homes. And in the Bay Area, it's very interesting, about 81% of all residential land is zoned exclusively for single family homes. And I encourage you, you know, in your community to find out what percentage of your residential land is zoned single family. And so, you know, so I talked about that in my community newsletter. I talked about all of this, and I explained that because of this, because of the racial disparity in income that persists, because 81% of our land is zoned for single family homes that are just more expensive by design, we are systematically shutting Black and Latinx families out of the Bay Area. This is, you know, by design, by our policy over time. And, you know, no, I didn't personally create these policies, but now that I'm in my position, you know, I have to ask myself and the community, you know, what kind of responsibility we have to undo these harms. And so I asked very openly in my newsletter to the community, you know, what does it mean to be an anti-racist progressive community? You know, here in Berkeley, we like to think of ourselves as very progressive. So I was able to use that and ask my community what it means to be progressive. And I also made that argument about wanting to give children from lower income households the chance to live in a high opportunity neighborhood. So it's somewhat of an economic argument there. And then asking, you know, what policies would need to change in order to give more children this opportunity. And there's really interesting data. I'll close by just mentioning that there's some really interesting studies that have been done. One was done in the 90s by the Federal Housing and Urban Development Moving to Opportunity experiment, where it was basically a randomized control trial where children randomly moved to high opportunity neighborhoods, and they were compared to children who did not. And, you know, there was a boost in lifetime earnings. There was an intergenerational benefit because the children who moved then ended up living in higher income neighborhoods, so that the grandchildren of the parents who had gotten that opportunity benefited. So it really is a way for us to address, you know, the disparity in income between families of color and white families, and also the lack of intergenerational wealth building that has compounded over time because of the inability for families of color to, you know, be able to buy that first home. So, you know, I don't have all the answers. We've done the referral. We haven't actually rezoned the whole city. So, you know, check back with me in 18 months and we'll see how successful we were. But we're certainly successful in having this conversation and talking about these issues. And I'm looking forward to, you know, being able to actually talk to people in person in the community now that we're slowly getting more, you know, vaccine coverage and seeing what people think. And I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rashi. And I think, you know, one thing that sticks out for me is hearing, you know, Manny talk about where we've come from, hearing Nadia talking about the framework through which we address that and like work toward a better future, and then hearing Rashi talk about what's currently happening now that we've got those things. It really kind of just demonstrates for me the arc of how we take a bad thing from the past that kind of continued on, you know, a little bit under the radar as we got more toward the future, what we can do about it now and what's happening now from these cities that are really leading the charge, like Berkeley, Sacramento, also created a plex zoning system for their city so that single family was not the predominant land use type. We're having that conversation now in San Jose about opportunity housing and allowing plexes in neighborhoods just as a normal housing typology, because not everybody wants to, but not everybody can afford to live in a single family home. And to say that we only want single family homes in some areas is exclusionary. And because what we heard from Rashi about the statistical significance of Black and Latinx families that are more inclined to be of lower income because of these historical injustices, what we're really saying is we're going to call this segregation by another name. And so I'm really just excited to continue to have this conversation. There's several good questions in the chat that we're going to address. I would encourage the attendees to add more questions to the chat, and also, I'm sorry, the Q&A, not the chat. Use the Q&A for questions, and then in the chat have that discussion about the responses and things that you're concerned about, and really have that dialogue. So a question that I want to start with first is Josh asked about AFFH, and you know, AFFH is a relatively new law that in California, at least, where we are, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I have two very protective dogs, and we have some workers around the house. So hopefully that doesn't continue to happen. But Josh asked questions about AFFH and like what can be done, essentially was the overarching question. And you know, we know about creating opportunities, we know about eliminating segregation and reducing reducing segregation to create balanced living communities. But I was hoping, Rashi, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you talk a little bit more about how you made that economic argument, which, you know, akin to moving from explicit to implicit racism, we have an economic argument that is also supported and partnered to, twinned with the racial arguments, the racial justice arguments.
Yeah, so, you know, I think this is interesting. I mean, I can say more about it. I think that I'm actually not inclined to make the racial justice argument personally. My inclination is sort of, I prefer to sort of just talk about wanting to give homeowners flexibility to, you know, add another unit to their property, you know, to maybe accommodate an adult child who couldn't afford to come back home, or a caregiver for somebody who's aging, and you know, sort of talk about that benefit that people could derive from having more flexibility within their property. But I also think that, you know, my colleague, Vice Mayor Lori Droste, you know, we talked about these arguments, and I think in her district in particular, because she represented that gated area that has very large, expansive single family homes, it was important to talk about that racial history. I represent a different part of town. I actually represent the redlined part of town, where we have duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and bungalow courts, and a lot more apartment buildings mixed in that were allowed historically that then became illegal over time. So I think for my part of town, I also represent a much more diverse part of the city. So you know, so you can see for me, it's sort of like it makes more sense to simply talk about the benefits that my constituents would derive. But Vice Mayor Lori Droste, you know, had a very different view because of the area she represented. It was important to talk about that history in her case, and I understand that. So we ended up, you know, different folks emphasize different things, and I think that the risk with the racial justice argument is, I think some of the pushback was people saying, you know, am I racist for living in a single family home? And of course, that's not the case. You know, I think of Isabel Wilkerson's new book about race, and she talks about race in America is sort of this old house that we've inherited. You know, none of us are personally responsible for the racist zoning laws that we've inherited. But now the house is in our care and we have to take care of it. And how are we going to do that? Well, we can uphold the way things have been, or we can reckon with it and start to undo some of the you know, sort of racist effects of the policies.
Thank you for that. And I really want to highlight, you know, every community is different, like you said, and every community is going to be particularly motivated by different arguments and different appeals. And so, you know, San Diego once had a thriving Black community that has slowly seen more gentrification and displacement happen, especially in the eastern portions of San Diego, particularly in Council District 4, which is Monica Montgomery's district. They have seen 3 different census tracts move from predominantly African-American to not, to being sort of just mixed ethnicities and mixed demographics. And there is no now leading or predominant demographic identifier in those census tracts. But that's to say that now San Diego has no census tracts, which are plurality. The predominant ethnic group is Black Americans. So we see this happen in places, and it's not necessarily a drive to push people out or to intentionally and purposely exclude people, but at the same time, not affirmatively furthering for housing or doing more than the minimum, doing more than what's just described in the law, but taking meaningful steps to prevent that kind of stuff. That's the new standard that we're in, and that's the new standard that cities and counties have to work toward. And with that, I wanted to pivot over to Nadia. We got a question from Randy about, you know, Piedmont and exclusionary housing, sort of, you know, by default, sort of just de facto, we only have single family, what can we do? And I'll say that Piedmont is a special case in that their city charter prevents the construction of attached or multifamily housing. Only single family housing is allowed this point forward. I think there's one apartment complex in Piedmont, but if you were to convert, if you were to, you know, I have $1 billion and I want to buy the grocery store in Piedmont and I want to demolish it and build housing, only single family housing is allowed to be constructed going forward. And so that is not a legal strategy that's going to be successful for them in their housing element update, which is on the horizon. And I was wondering, Nadia, if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the legal implications of cities that think that the way that our city is now is the only way it can be, and we have to kind of sprinkle things around the edges. We can't have any big changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's hard. Like, I think it's hard, like Rashi was talking about, to change hearts and minds to some extent. And there have, like, I think in thinking about the housing element, like, I think, the housing element can be used as a legal tool and a legal hook. So, I mean, if you know, there's certain requirements for what your housing element has. And if you have something in there that violates your housing element, or if you do something or take some action that violates the housing element, that's a basis for litigation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be successful, but it is a big hammer because you can ask court for a stay, and that basically would prevent any development from happening until, you know, they fix whatever issue or they reverse the decision. So this could be a big hammer if, like, for example, they are denying a multifamily family housing. I'm not familiar with Piedmont, so I can't address that specifically, but like the housing element has been used as a tool. The example I gave earlier of Buana Vista, there was some language in their housing element about preserving it because it is affordable housing, naturally occurring affordable housing. And so we did make that argument. The court didn't actually get to that argument, but you know, housing element can be used as a tool, as an argument for litigation. You know, cities are going to have to be doing more for housing, and a lot of these exclusive suburbs are going to be have to do a lot more for housing. And so I think as advocates, like, I think we need to think about all the tools in our toolbox. Yes, of course, we need to think about, like, you know, our policy advocacy, But litigation and lawsuits are something that we as a community should be really thinking about. You know, the other side already does. Like the other side, I shouldn't say the other side, but you know, people who are NIMBY who don't want development happening, you know, they use CEQA lawsuits all the time. You know, like I'm from Cupertino, you know, and you know that Valco, which is a mall that's been dead since I was in high school, and I'm 40 now. Like it's still like there's still barriers to it being developed, even with SB 35, and you know, and so you know, and unfortunately, the other side's been really successful at using litigation and trying to kill the project really literally by death by 1,000 cuts. But that being said, like I think that these are the housing element, AFFH, these are all tools in our toolbox, and I think we should be thinking about how to use tools in different ways.
You bring up something very important, Nadia, in that, well, a lot of it isn't, all of it's important, but one of the details I want to tease out is that the other side, this notion of, you know, NIMBYs who actively pursue sort of orienting a city or a community away from new housing and away from creating opportunities for self-preservation and, you know, a desire to maintain an investment, which is really to enrich themselves. That being said, the housing element requires, I'll paraphrase it, but you know, diligent public outreach to all economic sectors of the community. And so, Manny, I wanted to ask you, there's a comment or, you know, a question from Paul about how do we keep the NIMBYs from like gaming this public outreach process. And I wanted to say, like, in your response, if you could talk about the need for people like us and people who think housing is good and I want more neighbors, how do we more meaningfully participate so that the conversation is a little less skewed and more objective?
Yeah, no, and I think that's always a valid point. So, as someone who's had several years of community outreach, you end up kind of getting to know the people, and it's great that some people are super involved in the public policy process. But you know, I come from a city that is 90% people of color, and the folks that would show up to these community events would be half, you know, Anglo and Caucasian, like in general, and it would be surprising the sheer amount of kind of institutional soft power that is exercised through participation in you know, the boards and commissions. So our boards and commissions are not necessarily reflective of the demographics of our city. The individuals that run the neighborhood associations themselves, that are kind of like self-appointed gatekeepers that then have the ear of council, like those are all you know, positions that I think are also important. So it's not just the kind of 7 people or 5 people that you have in the dais as the council members, but then all the various places that people can get involved. So I highly encourage everyone to kind of look for those openings, because yeah, I can pretty much guarantee you that no matter what city you're in, there's some kind of very boring municipal board that will play a very important role in city policy, and that you need to be involved in that. So that's kind of the step one. But the step two that I think is also needs to be done by individuals. There are other folks here that work for cities or work with cities, and you know, I do believe in a more scientific, broad-based approach to actually surveying communities. So I think that just showing up and expecting people to show up does result in only getting a certain perspective when these types of meetings happen, rather than, you know, systematically saying, hey, look, we have these lower income communities that have this demographic, and the country as a whole invested a lot of money in getting this basic census data to get an understanding of where the community members are and what our demographics are. So why don't we use that to actually go out into a neighborhood and say, like, okay, we're going to go survey, you know, every 10 houses, and then kind of see what the feedback is from people that will not show up to these community meetings on a Saturday night or a Sunday because it's their only day off and they're going to spend it with their families. You know, I think that we default way too much as city and municipal agencies, expecting people to come to us rather than doing that extra work to go out. And I think that the end result is much richer when you do the active participation. In our particular community, we've done a better job of outreaching to our Spanish monolingual speakers. We still have ways to go with our Vietnamese speakers and our Cambodian community. So there's a huge gap there that's still you know, missing. So developing that capacity within a municipal agency is extremely important, and I don't think should be overlooked either, because again, those needs are going to be completely different. And I believe that if you talk to folks and engage with them over time, that's going to be a better way of getting public policy that is reflective of the needs of the entire community, not just those that always show up, no matter how obscure the meeting is.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you another question. I think that was all very on point. I mean, you know, I myself am a city council member in the Monterey Bay region, and we just, it's hard to do public outreach. And COVID notwithstanding, before that, after that, public outreach is really difficult because mail is expensive and not everybody is going to care or respond. Reverse 911, where you just do like automated messages to people, they get 5 seconds in here, this is the city of fill in the blank, and they hang up more often than not. Email blasts, you have to have an address to send it to. So if they're not signed up, they're not going to get the message. Text is the same way. What's the spam number? It gets flagged as junk. So I'm not even going to look at it. So really the answer then is pound the pavement. You have to find some sample, whatever the right number is for your community, and meaningfully do this outreach. And so I was wondering, kind of pivoting away from public outreach and community engagement, we had a good question from Zach about deed restrictions and tenant protections in the lens of naturally occurring affordable housing. And I would ask, how, if you could talk about some of the danger with trying to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing, and how it can go away, and why we have deed restriction, and how those things play together when we talk about housing elements.
Sure. Do you want me to tackle that one again? Yeah. Okay. So I guess it does vary from community to community. So the danger argument would be that you're essentially kind of removing development opportunities in particular areas if there are, let's say, substandard apartments or maybe kind of lower density areas that you would have potential opportunities to add units, right? So that those could be something there. But I would say my own particular community that, in fact, that's something I've been pushing more towards, is like finding ways to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing. It doesn't necessarily add units, but our big concern here in the city of Santa Ana is not necessarily that we're not producing units. Kind of for our size, we met the RENA goals this last cycle. The numbers were extremely small. I'm not going to disagree with that. And the city is on track to meet all the RENA goals, even though I guess we got about a 50% break on like our numbers here. The city will still be on track to meet all of those kind of production goals. So really, it's not like that area where my particular hometown has a problem. My particular hometown has a problem with renters being displaced and not being able to afford rent. So we have no basic rental stabilization ordinances. So I've still been pushing for more rent control here locally. I know that there's some long-term impacts that are of potential concern. But my immediate kind of way to stabilize housing are for the people that are already here in this lower income, kind of working class community, but that still have relative access to jobs, education, training, and it's still providing an opportunity for them to kind of advance economically. I really do feel that that is more the concern for my particular community. And that will actually, encourage us to hopefully down the road kind of try to preserve some of this naturally occurring affordable housing, because what we're seeing in our community is that because we are an opportunity zone, we're getting new investments for some of these larger apartment complexes. They're being refurbished and then the rent's going up like 10 to 20%. And the people that are going to be holding these investments are basically going to be getting a tax break for it, right? So relatively minor investment. It's a way to kind of store capital, and they're going to make a killing off of it. But the people that benefit from that are not from my community. When I look at the ownership records, I'm seeing zip codes that are much closer to the coast or much closer to other central metro areas, and that are not living here. So that is something that I believe it should be of concern for folks, and why I maybe don't worry so much. And I don't know what the other contexts are, but I don't worry so much about a city coming in and preserving naturally occurring affordable housing, so much as I am worried that a city will not take those steps.
Yeah, very, very good points. And Nadia, I wanted to ask you a question about your work with the mobile home park. Coincidentally, I was part of a team that consulted with the housing authority on that project with some of the local bond money to preserve the affordable housing opportunities there. And specifically, there was some recent news about the Winchester Mobile Home Park in San Jose and how Pulte Homes bought it. And I'm struggling to pull the details out of my mind. I only glanced at it, but there was conversation about offering relocation assistance. And I think there was a buyout opportunity. So it wasn't necessarily like investor companies snatching this up to redevelop it, but there were some either formal or informal tenant protections baked into the deal. Could you talk a little bit more about how we prevent displacement of people with not a lot of resources or who are vulnerable to displacement through this process?
Yeah, that was actually my case, so I can talk about it in a lot of detail. But yeah, so mobile home parks are like one of the last bastions of affordable home ownership for a lot of people, especially in places like Silicon Valley, and they're at risk, right? Because they're high density, they're low density, I should say, and and in some places there's just not a lot of land, and so I mean I think both Buana Vista. So in thinking about mobile home parks specifically, I think that there's a lot. What we had with San Jose specifically, like we convinced them to, change the general plan designation of all the mobile home parks in the city, and they have 59 parks, which is the most of any other state. And so that's one tool that we were able to use. And actually, the last cycle, as part of the housing element cycle, we convinced the city to put in there that mobile home park preservation is an important, it is one of their programs. And so, that was because we had that we were able to convince the city to change their general plan designation, have a really robust relocation assistance policy. And with the Winchester Ranch development, I mean, I think it's a really good example of development without displacement, because what we were able to work out was not just buyouts, but anyone who wants to stay at whatever Pulte is redeveloping, they get to stay for the rest of their lives. So Pulte is redeveloping it into like apartments and condos. And so, like the people get bought out, their mobile homes get bought out, but they can become renters with the same protections and at the same rents for, as long as they want to. And so, when we're thinking about things like naturally occurring affordable housing, like mobile home parks, like how can we create policies at the city level and as advocates to allow for development, to allow for higher density, but also do it in a way that doesn't displace the people that are already living there. And I think that was a very unique example, because there were enough people who bought out that they were able to do the construction in stages, so people can stay in a mobile home park if they want to until it gets redeveloped. But I think that we just have to start thinking about, as we're thinking about higher density, how to do it in a way that's equitable, that's going to keep the people who are from that community there.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that level of detail. I am struck by one thing you said, that people who would otherwise have been displaced but will not be displaced can continue renting at the same rate that they're at now. And I just wanted to make that distinction that they might own their home, but they rent the space that their home is located. And so while they got bought out of the home ownership opportunity that they had secured with their physical structure, they're going to rent, if they choose, I mean, as long as they'd like to, either the apartment or the condo unit, they'll rent that at the same price as what they had rented the space, so that while they got that they were bought out of their home, they're gonna be able to enjoy living in that same exact plot of land for whatever that rental rate was for that space. So it's not like, hey, give us your mobile home and now you can pay rent. It's, we'll buy your mobile home and what you were already paying will transfer to an apartment. And I think that those sorts of tenant protections are sort of the bare minimum. Like, before I was just living my life, minding my business, and then somebody chose to come buy this land and now I have to figure out where I'm going to go live. I mean, that's if you were a homeowner, if you owned a physical structure on dirt, or even a condo unit for that matter, you would be afforded all kinds of deference and protections for your investment. But when we think about people who live in mobile homes, it's almost like an epiphany that maybe they have some rights too. So this last question I wanted to ask of Rashi, we often hear, just by way of example, South Pasadena is sort of the boogeyman of the LA region, in that they claimed they were going to pursue an aggressive ADU strategy where they were going to build 600 ADUs over their 8-year planning period, which equals, roughly 75 a year. And when the housing element watchdogs, as part of this campaign for fair housing elements, started looking through their details, it turns out that last year they built 9. And the year before that, they built 12. And so to go from 9, 12, 15 up to 75, sure, you can, incentivize, you can remove constraints, you can streamline processes, but that's a pretty big jump. And so the idea that ADUs are going to solve our problems is maybe not in a policy sense the most practical, but in a practical sense, ADUs are not going to provide the density that plex zoning and apartments would. And if we're talking about opportunity, there's only so much land. So if we continue to pursue single family plus an ADU, that's going to be 2 homes per 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 square feet versus 4 or 8 or 20 or 40 per that same amount of land. So could you talk to me about and tell the group why you supported this kind of reimagining of how we use land in your city as compared with let's start a redevelopment company and put ADUs in everybody's backyard? And where that idea toward missing middle, how do we achieve that meaningfully instead of just enriching individual homeowners with this new income stream?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I'm not against ADUs by any means. So, what I'm trying to do is actually at the city of Berkeley does not have a very customer service friendly process when somebody wants to create an ADU. If you have that 200,000 sitting in the bank and you want to make an ADU, I think we need to make that as simple as possible because the state has liberalized those ADU laws. So I think local jurisdictions need to take advantage of that. But I think you're right. It is simply not enough, I think. And, I think the jury is out on the missing middle. I have said that, I don't know if any one thing is the silver bullet. But I think we do need to try it. And, most of our parcels are built on already. So it is, financially to go from, a parcel that has a single family home on it to a fourplex, there's economics there that, we don't fully understand yet. So we don't know how much this is going to be utilized. If we allow the missing middle, that's always the question, right? When you change zoning, how is it really going to be utilized? We certainly need to move in this direction. I think I saw some questions in the Q&A. Where we have large parcels of undeveloped land, like the surface parking lots at the BART stations, we are trying to do as much as we can. And there's been a state law that was passed by Assemblymember David Chu, AB 2923, that requires cities to zone their BART stations for large developments at a height of 7 stories. Our referral to the Planning Commission did not just stop at missing middle housing in the sort of low-rise residential neighborhoods. We also said, look at our transit corridors and go a lot taller. We need to explore that as well. So I think that we just need to do everything, make it easier for people who have the capital to do ADUs and want to do them, make that easy, allow for the missing middle, and go taller where we already have height on those transit corridors so we can accommodate people and have them get around town without cars. Those are all things that I'm supportive of.
I think that that's exactly the right approach. I mean, part of the twin of tenant protections is abundant housing, because if we say you have to buy people out and you have to secure rents for long term, you have to give them somewhere to live subsidized at their current rental rate, but then we don't build any new housing they might move into, well, what happens after the development is done? What happens next? And so it's both protecting tenants and, like you said earlier, in your example about the Castro, build more housing so that people can stay where they already are if they're renters or they don't control the land they live on and somebody comes and decides to adjust that for them. There's another question in the chat I just really briefly wanted to touch on, and that is, sorry, my Q&A, it keeps bouncing around. But there was a question about home ownership opportunities, and with the high cost of housing, in the Bay Area, and also generally across the state, like you were saying, 800,000 is the median price now across the state. Is it a better strategy to pursue rental opportunities? And I'll say very briefly that we need more of all types of housing. I don't know that anybody disagrees with that. And I think that we should be pursuing opportunities for people to buy homes, and those homes don't have to be 16, 25, 3,000 square foot single family homes. You can buy a condo, you can buy a townhouse, you can buy a 3-flat, you can buy any number of different housing products. And the American dream and the California dream is predicated on access to opportunity and the ability to finance that. And so having, spending 5 or 10 years in a house, or of whatever, a home rather, that generates equity, whereas living in an apartment or renting an ADU doesn't. And so, if we want to economically empower people and create access to opportunity in the long term and generationally, some type of home ownership is going to be key. And particularly in San Diego, there's a group, LISC, they're in San Diego, as well as other parts of the state. And I think, even nationally, they have a standing partnership with Union Bank and Bank of America and several foundations to buy old or, disused, in poor shape, single family homes in areas of opportunity, and build fourplexes as condos and sell each individual unit to BIPOC families, BIPOC households. And so that process, that program works in San Diego. Does it work in Berkeley? I don't know. Does it work in Sacramento? No idea. Santa Ana? You tell me. But we have to try to think up new and innovative housing strategies to ensure that people, that have been our neighbors forever are not locked out of the California dream. And if that means trying something new, don't commit your entire city budget to it, but you have to give it a try. You have to be willing to say yes to new things. And so with that, I wanted to make a pitch for everybody to visit the Campaign for Fair Housing Elements website, fairhousingelements.org, sign up as a watchdog. You won't get spammed with email, I promise, but the goal is look at your city, look at your neighbor city, your hometown, that bad actor city that always, the Clovis to your Fresno, the Palo Alto to your East Palo Alto, the Newport Beach to your Santa Ana, and pay attention to what's happening there. Tell us what's going on, because our team, the Fair Housing Elements team, is not 540, but the number of cities and counties is 540. So the more people who have their eyeballs on these things, the more people participating, going to meetings, reporting on meetings, activating around housing elements across the state, the better this process will be. And what happens in one place affects all of us. No city is an island except for Avalon, but that's only literally, not technically, or not metaphorically. And we are all going to affect another. If there's not enough housing in the Bay Area, that will push people into the Monterey Bay region. If there's not enough people not enough housing in Newport Beach and Costa Mesa and Tustin and the hills, then they're going to continue to sprawl out into the Inland Empire. And I breathe air that moves all across the state. I guess you do too. We're all affected by the water table and the food supply. And so if we don't take this seriously, we will pay for it, whether we support housing or we don't. So that's my quick call to action. That's my final words. Manny, Nadia, Rashi, do you have any parting thoughts for the group? I just want to say thank you all for giving us an hour and a half of your time and joining us on a Sunday.
Well, it's a very tough issue to find hope because, as I said, we're looking at 1 million median home price across the Bay Area, 1.5 million in Berkeley. So, I wish we had been having these, I know people were having these conversations many years ago. I see Dorothy Walker on this call who wanted to get rid of single family zoning in Berkeley in the 70s and was laughed out of the planning commission for that view. So I think we have to keep pushing on these issues, knowing that we may not see success you know, for a very long time, but that the way that change happens, it's not always a linear progression, right? Sometimes it can become exponential. And, you know, we have a converging set of crises with the affordability crisis and the climate crisis. So we didn't talk a lot about sustainability, but that's part of why I really support housing along transit corridors. So we have an opportunity in creating more homes in the urban core, in the high opportunity area where jobs are, to tackle both the affordability question and the equity problem and the climate crisis. So we just have to keep pushing and hope that eventually we will have that governing majority of assembly members and state senators we need to get some of these important bills passed.
Thanks, Rashi. And you're absolutely right. The sustainability, the climate, environmental justice aspect of this has not been central to our conversation today, but is absolutely central to this conversation. So I appreciate you highlighting that. Nadia, Manny, anything before we go?
Okay, I guess I'll go next. So the thing I think I mostly brought up was really kind of that burden of history, right? So like to me, when I work as a planner, I consider kind of all of those things that happened in our collective history, you know, even though I wasn't particularly, you know, present at that moment in time, but it is our current burden in our moment to do something about that. So I think that, you know, at least the historical work that I've done informs the way that I see planning and the role that I believe that, you know, different professionals have to kind of operate within the current system that we have and actively try to dismantle those instances of institutionalized power imbalances and structural racism, right? Like we are all embedded in those systems. And, you know, it's our responsibility to do something about that. You know, I can't be proud of all the work that people have done in the past while not trying to do something within the present. So that's something that I think, you know, kind of gets carried forward from history to now. But I also did want to echo, John, you touched upon the need for really understanding, and so did Rashi, the need to understand the financing mechanisms to make some of these developments work. And I do believe that, you know, we have had major historical precedents for more federal action when it comes to the creation of housing. And I think that realistically, all of the systems that we have in place are really kind of built for that suburban greenfield development model. And we need to start talking and thinking about what financing mechanisms do we need to have pretty much like zero cost guaranteed construction loans and a national sign-up list for anyone that wants to construct a fourplex so that they can kind of like work with those various, you know, kind of developers, financing institutions, and local agencies to be able to kind of streamline this process so that it's anyone that doesn't have, you know, 200K in the bank but just wants to sign up for a fourplex at a reasonable rate, you know, somewhere down the road. I think that those mechanisms really need to be thought up at the national level. And I'm hoping, you know, we springboard from these smaller conversations with our own neighborhoods, but then also to the bigger institutional frameworks that we operate from.
Yep, spot on, Manny. We can all have these dreams about what our cities could look like, but unless somebody can figure out the financing mechanism, it won't work. And that's why it's so critical. You know, you have a plot of land, you know, one person that builds a house on it for one household is going to pay 100% of that land cost. But if 10 households or 20 or 40 or however many households go there, the cost of that land is divided across all of those future households that will occupy that space. And that's a surefire way to make the cost of land go down and make development more feasible. So again, that's why ADUs are so expensive. Part of the reason is because the land it's built on is expensive and the speculative value is high, because an ADU in California City, out in the middle of the desert, I'm sure does not cost $200,000. But you know, you want to build in Berkeley, my ADU is crazy expensive, and you know, I'm not sure how I financed it, but we begged, borrowed, and stole, and here we are. So not really, but you know. Anyway, Nadia, final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I just echoing what Manny and Rashi said. I mean, I think it's really important for everyone to stay involved, to stay informed about what's happening, and also to try to make sure that the cities and jurisdictions that you work in bring in the voices of those who are most disenfranchised and who are going to be most effective, especially as we're talking about development that could affect the displacement of low-income families of color.
Thank you very much, Nadia. preaching to this choir, but you're absolutely right. And I just want to again thank everybody for joining us today and spending these 90 minutes with us on a Sunday afternoon. And please feel free to email folks and follow up and ask more questions. We are all very excited about housing work in our communities, and we want to continue to be part of the conversation where they happen. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to the speakers, and have a great rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.